Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am speaking again with Batya Ungar-Sargon. Batya is the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. I think I got that right. And she's also
Yep.
the author of the great recent book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Hi Batya, thank you for coming back on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So yeah, I've got to say I loved your book because
Oh,
no, I noticed the media stuff, some of it when I was overseas, and it's just little things. I was in Haiti after the earthquake, so Hurricane Thomas hit, and I'm watching the CNN news report, and there was a little creek in Port-au-Prince that we would drive by as we were going back to where we were living, and there was always people there getting water, washing up, whatever. And the reporter is like, "Oh my God, it's the hurricane's awful. People are getting, like people are like terrified, this and that." I walk outside, like meet a couple people. The flag on the flagpole is completely still. Like we light a lighter and the flame doesn't even flicker. And I was just like, just things like that. So I was just like, okay, there's something not right here. And then when I got back in 2014, and I saw that incident with, I believe her name was Melissa Click at Mizzou. She was the journalism professor, and there was a student reporter at a protest at the school, and then she called for muscle to have that student removed. Now she's a professor of journalism, and she's having a student reporter removed from
um,
a protest. And I was like, okay, there's something wrong here. I mean, she ended up getting fired, and people were like, oh, well, she got fired, she got taken care of. It's like, well, no. What led her to think like that? So, yeah, I mean, like I said, your book touched on so much of that. So, if you wouldn't mind, like, going into your book a little bit and talking about it, and
sure.
there.
Yeah. So that's basically what I wanted to understand with the book was I wanted to sort of crack this puzzle, which is, I knew that the views that I was increasingly seeing dominating the national liberal news media did not reflect what most even liberals that I know thought. And I wanted to understand how this, woke ideology came to have such a stranglehold on the media when the market for that to me seemed to be much smaller than the market for reasonable journalism. And yet increasingly, this was the only kind of journalism you could see outside of Fox News. So that was sort of the puzzle that I wanted to understand. Like I knew that the very radical binary critical race theory view of race and gender that we increasingly call woke and that we increasingly see dominating the news did not reflect how most of the liberals I knew thought. Most of the people of color that I know don't think this way. No working class people that I know think this way. And yet it seemed like all of those people had been abandoned by a news media that is actually profit driven. So I wanted to understand where those profits were coming from because it seemed to me it couldn't be coming from the numbers because these views are kooky. So that's really what I wanted to understand. And, tying into sort of this example you just gave where that professor, a woman teaching journalism, right, would call the authorities to protect herself from having a journalist do journalism, right? A student do journalism.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for one second. She didn't ask for authorities. She was calling other students over, saying, "We need muscle over here." Those are her exact words. So
Uh-huh,
okay, so
uh-huh.
sorry, just being a little pedantic.
No, no, good. I'm glad. Yeah, I don't remember the exact details, but it totally tracks. Like when did journalists become on the side of muscle, right? On the side of protecting people from having to answer questions rather than making them answer questions. And it's part of the same thing, right? Like the view of, certain people as being too weak or too vulnerable or too marginalized to be asked to bear the brunt of, responsibility for their actions, right? Which is sort of very much baked into the woke worldview. So, and what I found was that throughout the course of the 20th century, American journalism had undergone a class revolution, a status revolution. Journalism used to be a working class job, a blue collar job that you picked up on, on the job. You didn't go to school for it. You didn't go to college. Most journalists were not college educated. It was a low status job that was considered, the people who were journalists were not, it was not considered a glamorous job. It was not considered something that gave you status. And so journalists very much identified with the working class that they belonged to. And they saw themselves as sort of outside of power, demanding justice for the little guy who was always outside of power. And fast forward to today, and journalists are one of the most highly educated industries in America. They are also now, by and large, part of the top 10%. You have to essentially come from money in order to become a journalist because it's so hard to break into. And the opening salary is so low, but you have to live in the most expensive American cities, which is the only place there still is sort of a thriving journalism culture. And so as journalists became part of the elites, they abandoned the working class that they used to belong to, as well as all of their issues. And what I argue in the book is that the woke capture is just the latest stage of highly affluent, highly educated liberal journalists' abandonment of the working class, where essentially, instead of talking about the huge class chasm in America and the huge levels of income inequality in America, they talk about race, and they've sort of moved the scene of American inequality away from class, where it really is, to race, where I don't believe it really exists. And the reason they've done that is because liberals, like I said, that people in the knowledge industry job have very much benefited from the class inequality. And so it's very uncomfortable to talk about it. Better to talk about race because you can't do anything about your race, right? All you can do is feel guilty, which is, of course, something liberals really enjoy.
Yeah. It's I don't know, like there's that guilt thing. I mean, it's part of the WASP, ethic. I mean, it's, it certainly comes in with like, my mom grew up in Pakistan, so it certainly comes in with like South Asian moms, like, and then you have the stereotype of Jewish moms with the guilt as well. So I guess,
yeah, absolutely.
I guess, like all these people going to college and picking this up, but like, that's the one thing, like you mentioned the colleges and the class struggle. Like, okay, I went to university. I don't work. I got a poli-sci, I did my BA in poli-sci. I never went past that. And I work in IT. So, like my education helps me out in Jeopardy, and that's about it. But I would notice it, like I got out of school in 95. So I'm a little bit earlier, but I would notice it when I was working overseas, the people who had gone to college. So the people who were like the accountants, or like the admin staff and whatever, there was an air of superiority over like the tradespeople.
Yeah.
And even like the IT techs, and it's like, okay, this guy's keeping your communications running, and you've got, a master's in social work, and you're looking down at him. Like, I mean, and so was that part of it? Was it just like this thing where college became a status symbol? Because I mean, in the 80s when I was in high school, I started seeing that push where, everyone has to go to college. Everyone has to go to college. And they were like kind of shunning the trade schools, which I think was a huge disservice. But is that kind of what happened with like journalism, or one of the things that happened with it? It's like college became a status symbol. So these people are lowly, they're not as intelligent. So we're the benighted. We have to impart the wisdom. Like it was like a paternal type thing, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I say this as a person with a PhD. The number one thing they teach you at university is to have contempt for people without a university degree. It's absolutely a status symbol. And, of course, so what you had in America was you had all of these soldiers coming back after the Second World War, taking advantage of the GI Bill. Suddenly, there was a huge number of people going to college for the first time. And so going to college was no longer enough of a status symbol. You had to go to a fancy college, right? And you're seeing that now in journalism, to where, okay, so around the 60s and 70s was when the revolution really started, and journalists started increasingly coming from the college educated set. And so what happened was, it was no longer enough to have gone to college. You have to have gone to a fancy college. And now, especially with the collapse of the local news industry, where there's so few American journalism jobs, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, NPR, they take the vast majority of their interns from the top 1% of universities only because they can, right? Like that's purely the point of the internship is to teach you how to be a journalist. Like what difference does it make if you go to Harvard or Princeton or if you go to Michigan State, right? But no, that's because it's about fancy, right? It's not about actually an education. You can't teach journalism. Like you can't teach someone to be a good listener and to question their biases. And they certainly aren't teaching that at American universities. They're teaching people how to reinforce their confirmation bias and shut down anybody who disagrees with them. And yet those are the people now who are increasingly lording it over their elders at American newsrooms and then going onto Twitter and sort of getting them fired when they don't hew to the correct ideology. So it's very much tied to, the woke capture of the university, which used to be like safely ensconced in the ivory tower. And you had a whole bunch of academics who were kooks and like it didn't matter, right? But now because of the way that our economy works, it's extremely lucrative for people in knowledge industry jobs and extremely terrible for people without a college degree. So 2/3 of Americans without a college degree not only have to suffer the sneering and contempt of people who have a piece of paper, right, that proves that somebody in their family or they themselves were able to pay $120,000 for them to learn absolutely nothing. But not only do they have to endure that contempt, but they have to endure it while doing jobs that actually matter and not being able to support their families on them. I mean, that's the real injustice of the whole thing.
Yeah, the school thing. But okay, I want to. So I'm going to lay out a little bit of a hypothesis here, and like this might be a complete tinfoil hat theory, but this is just okay. Like, okay,
I love conspiracy theories.
Okay, no, but I'm somewhat like I'm somewhat not. I shouldn't say certain, but like I have some confidence in it because I've heard other people like John McWhorter echo some of the things I'm saying. Now this is just based off me reading, like starting to read critical race theory. Like I said, I did poli-sci in the 90s. So, I had some postmodernism and post-colonialism. Like I had some of that back then, but the actual like critical race theory and all that stuff, for me reading it and looking at the timeline of when it came out. So intersectionality as a framework got adopted in like between 90 and 92, it got adopted in the universities. And that's when that framework really took place. Mm-hmm. So based on that, by the end of the 90s, that's when you were starting to have the first PhDs, I guess, come out with like, social studies or sociology, but, focusing on African-American studies or like in any of the studies departments, like feminist studies or gender studies or whatever. You're getting that intersectional framework. And these people are coming out. And then, some of the stuff you'd mentioned in your book, and I think you also mentioned Zach Goldberg's work, like some of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So around 2000, or let's say if you want to go to 9/11, when the Bush administration, like, okay, you had the attack, then, okay, you're going to go to Iraq, you're going to go to Afghanistan, all the racism, the Islamophobia thing. So they're going out and hiring, people to like diversity consultants or whatever, people to work on racism problems, isn't that? They're getting these PhDs. These people are going into HR in all kinds of places. Like I'm sure in the media, I'm sure in, like newsrooms, entertainment, but anyway, they're become the HR. By Obama's first term, you've managed to get enough of these people in. They've hired other people in the same thing. Then you started getting woke reporters coming in. Like if you want to just talk about the media. By Obama's second term, I think that's when the pushback should have happened. A lot of people were like, oh, well, they went crazy after Trump. I'm like, no, they went crazy in Obama's second term. And I don't think it would have mattered who ran as a Republican candidate. If a Republican had won, they would have gone almost as crazy as they did with Trump. I think this problem needed to be nipped in the bud back in like 2012.
So I agree with you that they started to go crazy in Obama's second term. And that's what the data shows. It shows that the great awakening within news media, the skyrocketing of woke terminology, like woke, like white privilege and oppression and marginalization. And then like my favorite is like the word the phrase people of color next to the phrase marginalized or oppressed, right? Creating that neural synapse in your mind and in the good white liberal's mind that people of color are marginalized and oppressed, right? That all started around 2011, 2012 when the New York Times erected its paywall and when digital media, when establishment media companies started to go digital and understand how digital media works. that's when those words started to proliferate, because they figured out how to hack into the emotions of affluent white liberals and to get them to click on things and to get them to stay on page, right? They were simply hacking Google search optimization. That's where all that came from. And by 2015, the sociologists like brilliant Zach Goldberg, found that they had shifted public opinion among white liberals to where white liberals were more radical on race than blacks and Hispanics. That was the great awakening. It started in the media. And Zach is very clear in his research that it really caused that shift in public opinion. You're totally right. It preceded Trump. I do think if, Ted Cruz had won or Mitt Romney had won, Mitt Romney didn't run against Trump, but, if Marco Rubio had won, if one of these people had won, it wouldn't have been you wouldn't have seen, Rubio's name 97,000 times in the New York Times in 2017, because I think a lot of what enraged the left about Trump was about class. He was so clearly a tribune of the forgotten, erased working class, increasingly of all races, by the way. And I think that sort of return of the repressed, the voice of the voiceless, rising up and poking them in the eye and being so undignified about it, it really made them crazy. He was the perfect combination of like actually being undignified and gross and appalling in his speech, and representing the class interests of the erased working class that the Democrats had abandoned with a lot of his sort of very protectionist economic policies, which were things that Bernie Sanders had been pushing in 2015. So I think that, putting the lie to a lot of their pieties, which, as I argue in my book, are about disguising the ways in which they've benefited from economic inequality. So I think that he was a really unique blend that made them really go crazy, essentially, and they're still in the grip of it. So I a little bit dispute you on that, but I totally agree with you that it started before Trump, and I think in fact Trump was very clearly a reaction to rising wokeness and to the erasure of the working class and the erasure of class issues from the liberal agenda.
Okay, just kind of sticking with this, because this is something that's starting to it's really frustrated me over the last couple of years. I guess especially like since the last U.S. election. Okay, when Trump got elected, there were a lot of people like, okay, the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, whatever. Okay, they're going to cover Trump. Their news outlets, that's their job. I'm not arguing about that. Like, I'm not talking about maybe yes they did too much, but they're going to cover the president, right? So that's not an issue. But like quote unquote public intellectuals. So there were a lot of people who said, what you kind of hinted at there, that the excesses of the left is what caused people to vote for Trump. Like, people who had voted twice for Obama, all of a sudden were voting for Trump. Like, they didn't
8 million. 8
million. So I mean, you can't, you can't just count that off to racism and whatever. So there were a lot of people who'd said that right after he got elected, but pretty much, right around the time of the inauguration, it went to all Trump all the time about how bad it was. And they didn't do anything to fix their own side or make their side more electable. Like, honestly, it's kind of hard to say it now, like, hindsight, whatever, but I think if COVID hadn't happened, I think we'd be in a second Trump term right now. It'd be
For sure.
And I'm like, okay, everyone's still, you're still Sam Harris. He's still fighting Trump. Like, he's still fighting against Trump.
It's embarrassing.
And I'm like, okay, what's going to happen when the Democrats get spanked in the midterms? Like, is it, like we saw what happened with Youngkin in Virginia, and like a lot of these families were Asian, and they're calling them white supremacists. And it's like, come on. So if the Republicans do well in the midterms, it's going to be a nightmare again. And like, I'm like I said, the frustration I have is you didn't make your side electable. Like, you didn't fix your side. It got worse. And it, like I said, that and it frustrates me, not because I'm an American, because I have that woke spillover coming into Canada, and we've got a completely woke prime minister we have a ministry of critical race theory, for Christ's sakes. That has
really?
Okay, we have a ministry of diversity, inclusion, and youth, and their first mandate is to set up an anti-racism secretariat for the government to make sure the government is anti-racist.
Oh no. That's terrible. I'm sorry. I'm laughing because like I can't believe somebody has it worse than we do.
Oh God, we have it so bad. But yeah, like that's like, but like I said, that's why I'm so frustrated. I'm like, you had 4 years to try to fix your side and you didn't,
Yeah.
and you're still doing it. You're still fighting against Trump. When I mean, come on. It's just, sorry, I had to get that out. It was just
Yeah. No, I hear you. I think that I think it seems very clear that the Democrats are not going to do well in the midterms. My frustration right now is with the Republicans not taking advantage of this moment. Because it seems to me like it's so clear the ways in which the Democrats have abandoned the working class, the way that they have failed to, have anything remotely resembling some sort of Black agenda that would actually help the problems in the Black community that the Black community faces. And it seems to me like there's such an opportunity here for Republicans to go into places like Oakland, or Brownsville and say, look, I am going to run on school choice and making sure your kids don't get shot on their way to the school that you choose, and that they could clean up, and they just don't show up. So I feel like a lot of frustration with both sides. Like I feel a frustration with the Democrats for abandoning the people they claim to represent and trying to force progressivism on them when it's clearly not a good fit for this community and clearly does nothing for them, further immiserates them. But then on the other side, it's like, it's so obvious, 2/3 of the Black community is either conservative or moderate. And yet they're stuck voting for the Democrats because the Republicans don't show up. So I feel like there's that failure to take advantage of that moment. It's pretty much all I talk about when I go on conservative radio shows, because I just don't understand it. And I think this is like a really important issue.
hey, like I don't know enough about that to comment on that. But one thing I will say, okay, when I first got back from overseas and I started seeing all this stuff, and I mean, it was like it was centered more on Islam, but two things went through my head, and there was a quote from Paradise Lost, and it was, like Bash the Devil stood and felt how awful goodness is, and that's what these people did. Like I mean, it goes on to see like how it's all virtue and shape and whatever. Like they turned goodness awful. That's what these people did. Like the woke, the social justice warriors, whatever you want to call them, they turned goodness awful. And the other thing that went through my head was, I think it's from Henry the Fourth or Henry the Eighth.
Huh?
It's Richard the Third. Richard the Third says a line, and it goes on. It's a long soliloquy, but one of the lines is, "I'm going to set the murderous Machiavel to school." And I was like, okay, you're getting an overcorrection. Like,
Yeah.
So what I see the Republicans doing now, and okay, the anti-CRT bills again, I'm not 100%. Okay, I don't like the way some of them are written. Some of them I thought were written very well, like the one in North Dakota. Sorry, I think it's Idaho, where all they did was reiterate the federal civil rights law and state civil rights law. They just said, we're upholding this, and you can't teach anything in your classroom that, contradicts, like goes
right,
against.
Exactly. It's like there are actually laws out there that, obviate critical race theory. You just have to enforce those.
When I see what's going on in places like Oklahoma, where they're letting parents sue libraries for books that they have that the parents don't like, okay, that is an overcorrection, because nothing was being done and parents wanted something done.
Right,
or what's going on in Texas, like, I don't want critical race theory based education, just like I don't want intelligent design. But if they want to have, and obviously I think it has to be age appropriate, but if they want to have how to be an anti-racist in the high school library, I think that's should be fine.
Right, totally. You combat bad ideas with good ideas, right? Like that's the core of liberalism.
So like that's where I think, like, that's my frustration with the Republicans right now, is they are doing that overcorrection, and yeah, they're not doing what, like people like Matt Getz and Marjorie Taylor Greene should not be your face. But on their side too, like there might be a bit of frustration, like Trump's diamond plan or platinum plan or whatever. I don't know all the details of it, but like,
it was so good. And he put it out a month before the election, like the cynical yokels that they are. And it's so frustrating, because that platinum plan would have been such a game changer. And I think it would have been a game changer in the election. Where were they? Why didn't he come in on day one with that and say, you know what? whatever I do, whatever else I do, I'm going to do this. Like, it's frustrating because they had, I forget who said this recently, but, Trump had a lot of the right answers to a lot of the biggest questions, but he was just such an nincompoop and a narcissist that he couldn't keep it together long enough to make it happen.
But I mean, again, that's like why I think your book is so important.
Thank you.
Okay. We need to fix academia, but after that, you have to fix journalism, because I mean, if people don't have access to information or things that they can trust, I mean, okay, this is going to go a little bit past media for a second, but okay, COVID, where we are right now with COVID. Now, the whole debate around vaccines or whatever, but you had the American Medical Association, you had the New England Journal of Medicine, you had, 1,000+ doctors. I mean, and then, CNN, New York Times, all these places going on about how racism is a worse virus than COVID, and how, they're not freaking out about the Black Lives Matter protests and the riots, but people going to a church service in a parking lot in their cars, getting ticketed while they were sitting inside their cars. Okay, and they're calling those people idiots and yahoos and stuff. And then, again, American Medical Association, whatever, ACLU is not science, but I'm trying to think of who else. I think maybe the APA. And again, I think
New England Journal of Medicine itself was.
Yeah, no, but I'm talking about when they were talking about birthing persons instead of women. I'm like, okay, these are quote unquote respected medical outlets, or science outlets, and they're denying biology. Now you don't want to trust them about the vaccine. I'm like, there's so much that was caused, so much of like the vaccine hesitancy, so much of all this stuff that was caused because of bad reporting and how corrupt these organizations have gotten. Yeah. And I mean, if we had a reliable media, maybe these organizations wouldn't have gotten that bad. It's like, because I mean, you look at this and these places, I don't know if you can trust them again.
It's really bad. I mean, the CDC beclowning itself at the moment when Americans most needed it to be a bulwark against polarization and partisanship and to be above the fray and to tell them what to do, it became impossible to trust anything that they said because of their clear partisan bent. And then if you said that you were, called a conspiracy theorist or whatever, and, like you said, the people getting, basically penalized for being religious, and while they had to watch, the kind of religion of the other side, the politics of the other side get a pass. But it's not just that. Sagar and Jetty made a really good point last week on Breaking Points. He said Twitter banned Trump, right, after January 6th. Turns out Trump is like one of the only people pushing the vaccine on the right, certainly among his supporters. All of the other people, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, all of these people, they're sort of kowtowing to the mob and being like, don't get it, whatever. I don't know if they're actually saying don't get it, but, very much, pushing the kind of conspiracy theories. Trump is the only one out there being like, this has my name on it. Go get it. This is my achievement. Go get it. And they kicked him off of Twitter, meaning like they kicked off a person with 40 million followers who could have told people to go get the vaccine. And like, how much did that change the conversation, right? So in order to, stop him from all of this stuff around the election, from spreading that stuff, from spreading all that misinformation about the election, they actually maybe stopped him from spreading probably true things about the vaccine, which was that, in some cases, at least in Delta, it seemed like it was very effective. So it's this, I don't want to say collusion, but it's like there's this sort of it's very clear that there's a new Democratic coalition that includes big tech and, Silicon Valley, big tech, the CDC, a lot of the medical establishment, especially when it comes to gender issues and when it comes to COVID, and then, the university and journalism, right? And the media, that's anything that's not conservative media is part of that same kind of cohort that's now really the center of gravity on the Democrat side. And it's extremely powerful. There's an almost complete lock on cultural institutions. That's why movies and TV shows and books are terrible now, because everyone is sort of creating art, like, with trembling fingers, like trying to make sure that they don't offend anybody. And to ask people to act like that's not happening, or to put the responsibility on people who don't have a college education, who maybe don't even have a good high school education, expect them to tease out where you're being a Looney Tunes partisan hack and where you're actually giving them information, medical information that they need. You know what I mean? It's a big ask to ask people who know you hate them, right? Who know you have contempt for them because you never bother to hide it.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a lot of other things. Like, it's just the misinformation, or just like, I shouldn't even say misinformation, like just the conflicting messaging. Again, you know, I'm not one way or another. I'm not talking about election stolen, or whatever, because I think it's been pretty well shown that it wasn't.
Agreed. For the record,
okay, yeah,
agree.
But let's just, okay. So you've got one side again saying, okay, racism is a worse virus than COVID. It's okay. Like, they're not denouncing the riots or the protests. I mean, a story came out about how New York City, and I believe Washington State and California, I know from New York City for a fact, we're telling the contact tracers not to ask people explicitly if they went to BLM protests. If the person gave that information up, fine, but don't ask them. They wanted to hide that. Now, okay, you've got that going on. And then they're saying you can't stand in line to go vote. So now, when Trump says they want to mail in votes because they want to steal the election from me, both of these are, you could say they're ludicrous statements. But what makes more logical sense? A racially conscious virus that's not gonna, that's not gonna attack you if you go to BLM protests, or that they're lying to you and they're trying to steal the election? I mean, one of them, okay, like I said, you can say they're both crazy, but one of them makes more sense than the other. And
so to be fair, that they did make the argument that the BLM protests were outside and that a lot of the people were masked. And the funny thing, I saw a hilarious TikTok. It was someone who had been at the BLM, I guess maybe even not just the protests, but the riots. And she was watching footage of the January 6th assailants. And she was just cracking up and like, these guys aren't even wearing masks. Like, they don't know how to do crimes. Like, are they crazy? Like, the first thing you do is put on a mask. So to be fair, like they were outside, people were wearing masks. I don't know that they were wrong to tell people that it's okay to go to the BLM rallies. The problem was when they told people they can't go to church when it's outside, or they can't go to, ball games, or they can't do, follow their conscience to do the things that are important to them, right? It was like the privileging of one spiritual exercise over another, or one, political one over another. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you essentially. I just wanted to throw out there that they did make that, stipulation. It wasn't just like, racism is a greater threat than COVID, or that the virus itself was supposedly like could tell where you had got it. Although, definitely one got the impression that they thought that.
Yeah, but even by then, I mean, there was, if you followed certain people, and I don't want to, like, he might have done it because I know Nicholas Christakis did a lot of stuff on COVID, but it might have been a couple other people. Like, just because you were masked, it depends on how much time you're spending around people. So just because you're masked and you're 6 feet away doesn't mean, even if you're outside, you can't be in close proximity.
And now we know that the cloth masks do absolutely nothing, right? It's like, if you don't have a KN95, like, forget about it. But they didn't know that at the time. But the funny thing is, instead of saying we were wrong, right? They're now saying, well, now your child needs a KN95, right? Instead of saying like, look, okay, we got this wrong, the cloth mask. They're saying now, no, you have to spend all this money and get the upgraded mask, or we won't let them in. It's like ridiculous.
Yeah, but that's another. I think that's another problem here, is they never admit that they were wrong.
Exactly.
They're just like, oh, we were always saying this.
Yeah.
It's like bullshit.
Yeah, or Fauci a couple of weeks ago saying, look, we can't just put society on a hold. And I'm like, where were you before 1 in 5 American businesses was shut down? Like, come on, like, how dare you say that now?
Okay, about that, with like the way this is all being reported, and like the fear mongering that was going on. I mean, there was a thing that just came out today about like how many trillions of dollars the wealthiest, people in the United States made over the pandemic. But, like, you're talking about the businesses that shut down. Like, again, these useless rules, like you can go into a Walmart, because they can control the number of people that come in, but you can't go into a little mom and pop shop. But I'm sure a little mom and pop shop can put up a sign saying, okay, we'll only let in 3 people at a time or something. Like, I don't think that's too hard for them to take care of, So you're letting people, they could find, order off Amazon, but how many people were working in the warehouse?
They really they conflated what was a question of economic privilege, right? Being able to stay home and have a working class person bring you your food, and your cat food, and all, be police officers and, be out in the streets. That's an economic thing. And they conflated that with virtue, with like being free of the virus and like, slow the spread. And we're the ones who care. And what, how could you be so individualistic and not care about anybody else? And that's essentially the thesis of my book, is that wokeness is essentially, affluent elites dressing up their economic privilege as a form of virtue, as a form of social justice. And it's deplorable.
Yeah, I saw someone say that like not too long ago. I think it was just right after New Year's. Blah blah blah. The virus is still a big thing. Do your part. Stay at home. Just order all your food.
Right. Right. Exactly. Do your part. Stay at home and expose working class people to this thing, like a good rich person, like a good liberal. Right. That's what liberals do. Is they expose the working class and they protect themselves.
Or the hypocrisy. And again, it's. Whatever. Now you're hearing about Boris Johnson, the party, like Downing Street over Christmas, but like they're showing pictures of events, and all the attendees, all the socialites, whatever, none of them have their masks on, but all the people doing all the work
all
are
the
walking
servants,
around.
yeah.
And it's like you people are degrading. You're degrading yourselves as well as you're kind of looking down at them.
Totally. Glenn Greenwald had a really, really beautiful piece after AOC went to the Met Gala, where he really pointed out that like the thing here is not what's written on the back of her dress. The thing is what's written on the faces of all the celebs with no masks, and the sort of surf class behind them, all masks, carrying her train and literally waiting on the people who have the economic privilege to not wear their masks. It's really disgusting, because it's so clear, and like I feel, for example, I don't like being asked for my vaccine status when I go to a restaurant, because I think it's first of all, I think it's racist given the demographic breakdown in America, and I feel like it's sort of contravenes like my sense of autonomy or whatever. But hell, if I am going to make a working class person be the front lines of my outrage, like I would never do that. Like I would never make them be, what I mean, stand in the face of my fury, my political feelings. No, I'm going to show it to them and thank my lucky stars that I don't have to be a hostess at a restaurant, because I have the privilege to work from my house, And I think that you just see so few people having that point of view. Like, just respect the people whose jobs are not as comfortable as yours, that enable you to sit at home in your pajamas. Have some humility to that privilege. No, they never do.
Okay. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I asked you about this because the news coverage of the hostage taking in a synagogue, in Texas.
Well, tell me how you saw that, because you're so smart on these kinds of things.
Okay, but I'm looking at this, and the Guardian and BBC said blah 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 hostage. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was like hostage situation in Texas, and they put hostage in quotes.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay, okay,
hostage, alleged hostage.
Yeah, like come on. No, but I saw this, and it's just
I know.
And I don't want to make the comparisons or whatever, but my mind ran to the Tree of Life shooting, and it was like, okay, the guy was a white supremacist. I'm not defending the guy who did it, and whatever they said about him was right. But they didn't stop to think, will this paint all white people as bad or whatever? Because the guy was a white supremacist. You talk about white supremacy, but in this, right away you're talking about Islamophobia and this and that. It's like, no.
The hostages were still at gunpoint when you had people being like, a lot of Islamophobia is going to come out because of this. Let's all be careful. Let us remember who the real victim of this anti-Semitism is.
I'm like, come on. And it just, no, but it drives me
it's so disgusting.
No, but absolutely. But okay, but also then if look back to, I think it was Hanukkah in 2019 when you had like that spate of attacks.
Yeah.
There was an article about how it was, I believe it was after the worst attack when it was a black man who'd end up killing that rabbi. and they said, oh, let's not have this incident, let's not use this incident to have whiteness divide us. It's like,
Oh yeah.
pardon? Like, I mean,
I think actually Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman Tlaib, actually called him a white supremacist, and it was like, he's a Black Israelite.
yeah, but no, but I mean, that's what I mean. Like we talked about this last time too, but I mean, it's there's a really insidious form of anti-Semitism coming out of the left, and it's like you saw it again in the BLM riots. You had Nicole Hannah Jones talking about how whiteness is property, and it wasn't a big deal that some synagogues got vandalized.
Yeah, it's so funny because it's so racist to say you can't condemn anti-Semitism in the Muslim community because it suggests that all Muslims are actually complicit when actually many Muslims are fighting the anti-Semitism in their communities, right? Like they obviously don't support it. And it's the same thing with crime in the Black community, to act like we can't talk about it, right? Because it's somehow racist to talk about it. Not only does that ensure that more Black children are going to die, but it suggests that Black people don't hate crime, like that they don't oppose crime. It's like the idea that somehow every person of this race is implicated in the crimes of like, a hostage taker who came out of nowhere, right? Who was acting completely by himself, like that somehow we can't say, look, the waters he was swimming in told him that the way you get somebody out of prison in America is you go to a synagogue and you have that synagogue call a New York synagogue, and then that rabbi called the president, and boom, like step 3 profit, right? Like they get, they're going to release them, right? You just get your Jews in a row, and then, right? Like it's like the idea that like pointing this out is somehow dangerous to Muslims, as opposed to like the opposite, that allowing this to proliferate, like allowing these stupid ideas to proliferate unchecked, like that is the thing that is dangerous. But it's like, if somebody comes from a quote unquote marginalized community, there's a lot of pressure among, left-wing media types and all of the people around them, all the people in that activist Twitter set, to really either sort of memory hole it or just have a complete taboo about talking about it, or make sure we have the right context. And I mean, to Jews, it definitely feels like this gets even worse with anti-Semitism, because like in the woke binary, we get put on the side of whites, and of course nobody's allowed to feel sympathy for whites. But I really do think that it's sort of, I think the primary victims of this mentality are Black children and Black elderly people and Black people who are the victims of crimes that nobody's willing to talk about.
Yeah, I used to call it benevolent bigotry, but it's just plain old bigotry. I mean, that bigotry of low expectations. And I'd said this before, and it's, give me the out and out hostile racism of a David Duke, as opposed to this wishy-washy, like the stuff that comes from like what you're talking about, like on that side of the left, right? Like the woke left or whatever, that side of it. It's, like a David Duke might say, oh, look at these, whatever X people, they don't know how to take care of themselves. We have to go fix their problems because they're whatever, they're children, they're useless, whatever they go. But from the woke side, it's not only is it, we have to go there and help you fix it, but you're too facile to have caused it yourself because, we originally caused it for you. Now we have to go fix it.
Right.
So, I mean, like, at least David Duke's giving me the agency of saying I caused my own shit.
Right. Yeah. What does it feel like to be on the receiving end of this?
I don't take it. I'm sorry. Like, I'm not going to be infantilized. Like, it's, you can, obviously I'm not saying be racist towards me, but I mean, okay, with my friends, and obviously I think it depends on who you are and who how you know the people, but these are people I've known since high school or grade school, and we joke around, and they'll make fun of me, I'll make fun of them.
Right.
So it's kind of like, okay, that's your acceptance type of thing, but we make fun of everyone and everything. So but if they were to treat me differently, like, oh, okay, well, we're not going to, make any brown jokes or like, jokes about Indian people or whatever around you because, it's going to hurt your feelings. Like, no, screw that. Like, like that's actually treating someone differently. That's actually treating them as, okay, you're not able to take that. You're too weak and fragile. It's like, no, I'm not. Like,
Yeah.
No,
I mean, yeah.
Well, look, like I said, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but if you got any last words about, how maybe we can get around this, or like how people can try to avoid being siloed in by the media, like just
Yeah, I would say like I think the most important things are having humility towards other Americans, other people who have less than you, other people who disagree with you, and just keeping in mind that every time you feel like that sense of rage reading something on the internet, someone's making $1 million off of your heart, and you don't have to let them do that. You can train yourself to be like, instead of being like, oh, I can't believe somebody thinks this on the internet, you can train yourself to be like, oh ho, someone's trying to make money off of me, and remember that you don't have to hate your fellow American for somebody else's profit motive. That's sort of I think the lesson of my book.
well, great. Well, thank you very much. It was great talking to you again.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you both on Twitter and your podcast and having me, your interest. And really, thank you for all the kind things you said about my book. It really, really means a lot to me coming from you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. I'll be back.